Maria, I'm going to leave it to you to kick us off and then
I will. Sorry, I was actually kicked out of our own event, but yeah, let's get going. Hello, everyone, and a warm welcome to the first session in this four-part series called "How to Build an Environment Where People Can Do the Best Work." So I'm Maria, and I'm the VP of Marketing at Jiminny, and we are incredibly excited to be hosting this event series with the team behind What Drives Winning. I'll be handing over to Brett and Becky in a minute. Before I do, I'm not sure we need housekeeping rules anymore because we're so used to these events, but just make sure you're muted when you're not obviously participating. And we'd also love to hear your views after the event today. So feel free to send us any feedback so we can make tweaks for the next one. I think that's it. If there aren't any comments or questions at this stage, I'll hand over to Becky and Brett.
All right. Thank you, Maria. And is there any way as we get started, you could make me a host so I can share my screen or am I able to do that without being a host?
That's a great question. I will make sure that Devon, who sits in the background, will make you a host because she just made me one. So we'll try to sort that as soon as possible.
All right.
Because I can actually share screens. Yeah.
So let's go ahead and get started. And then what I'm going to challenge everyone that's on this call to do is to pull up their chat. And that way we can interact with you that way. So the first question that I'd like to ask you all would be, what do you think the difference is between behavior management and character development? How would you answer that question? What is the difference between behavior management and character development? And Becky, when you will start to see the chat come in, when I first asked you that question before we got started, what was your answer?
I think I would have said that behavior management is something that I would want to try to avoid because I'd want to get it done through character development.
And that is who you are at your core. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to share this so everyone should be able to see. And so when we talk to coaches, a lot of them will say that character development is the long game and behavior management is right now. Now, if I was going to ask everybody on the call, which one is more important in your mind, what would you say? When we ask coaches that, all of it goes to what side? The character development side. And that's what's so interesting because here's what we've learned. Behavior management is right now. So how you navigate the current is where trust is accessed, particularly when situations catch you off guard. And so if you don't have trust, then there's no way that they're going to give you access to shape the person that they're becoming. So that's what we're going to talk about is around behavior management. And we actually prefer the word environment to culture because environment is right now. And how we navigate the right now is what shapes the long game. Becky, this is a little bit of a paradigm for coaches.
Yeah, it is because I think that we try to think about team culture like it's such a big word and thought in our profession. And I think in anybody that works with a team, like the team culture is like super important. But I don't think we think about how we can't even start to access that without dealing with the day-to-day. And the day-to-day is the credibility piece.
Amen. And when I asked a NBA GM, what is your role? This is what he said: to build an environment where people can do their best work. So I'm going to challenge you all to throw this in the chat. If I was asking you from a leader perspective, what do you think the most important thing that you do to build an environment where people can do their best work is? What would you say? Give you a couple of seconds here to type in the chat how you'd answer that. What's the most important thing that you do as a leader to build an environment where people can do their best work? Becky, as those start to come in, how would you answer that?
So my previous environment to now was collegiate coaching. So I'm dealing with 18 to 22-year-olds. Now I'm a professional coach, so I'm dealing with a slightly older age group. But I would say they're still similar in the sense that, I would like to teach people how to be resourceful for themselves, to find their own answers and to coach themselves, as opposed to me providing the answers. I think that would be the best thing I could do to get people to do their best work.
And to simply put to what Becky's saying is, we try and build a platform where people can coach themselves. That builds trust, it builds autonomy, it encourages them to take risks and have us support them. And I think that's represented in a lot of what everyone's saying. I wish the text could be voices, Becky.
I know. There's some really good answers here. I love them.
I know, and it'd be so cool to hear from you all. I would have many questions. But when we ask coaches that, it usually comes down to three things. And it's how they define, manage, and model their expectations as a leader. Defining is proactive. Managing is reactive. And modeling is all the time. And so we're going to just do a very quick overview of where we're going to head with these 4 sessions. And we're going to start with define. An athletic director who oversees 20 sports sent me this. And he said that this is what he wanted to build his first meeting of the year around. Quote from Neil Armstrong, first man on the moon: if you're an inch off landing, no big deal. If you're an inch off takeoff, you missed the moon by 1,000,000 miles. Becky, if I was asking you and everyone on this chat, you can think through, how does that quote apply to teams? Becky, you would say what?
Oh, this is such an interesting one for me because, I was dropped into this team at the middle of the year where that, the takeoff wasn't mine. And I think that's super interesting because when the takeoff is yours, the more that you can put structure and define around what it is you're expecting, the better chance you're going to get to where you really want to go.
It's such a good point. And so we almost had to try and course, because you're going to course correct, but the philosophies that you walked into were actually much different than anything you would have laid the foundation on, which makes it very interesting. So the AD challenged me. He said, find me a video that describes this quote. And this is what I found. This is a Pop Warner American football example. Take a look at this. And keep your eye on the coach at the bottom. Right? And if we had graphic representation of what this looks like, it might be this. And so obviously that's what chaos looks like. And if you contrast the difference with that clip and this clip, what do you notice? Becky, when you see this clip, what are you thinking?
I just think of the efficiency of that second clip where it's so defined. Everyone knows what they're doing. The arrows point the way. Everyone has their individual job and it's just clicks. And
every job's important, right? Like if they don't get the lug nut on correctly, and the amount of training that goes into that level of efficiency is insane. And if we had graphic representation of that, it would be all the arrows going in the same direction. And that's really what defining is about. It's a proactive approach to define the expectations of what you're after. The second thing we're going to look at, and before we do, I want to just challenge you all. This is kind of fun. Managing is reactive. And so there's going to be behavior that is good and it's winning behavior. And then there's going to be behavior that's bad and it's losing behavior. If I ask the question to everybody on this call, what is a scenario that you've been put in the last 90 days that was below the line, so not desired behavior, that you had to manage, that completely caught you off guard? So what is below the line behavior that caught you off guard, that you had to manage in the last 90 days? I would love to see the chat start buzzing. because what we can do is we can start to build a playbook of all the random things that come your way that you have to figure out how to do. Becky, how would you answer that question?
Well, I remember one of the first weeks that I was coaching here with the pro team. One of the players let me know on the night, like we played the game, the night that the game ends, and she says, "Hey, I'm not returning with the team. I'm going to stay in this town for a few days, so I'll miss practice." And I was like, "Is this something that happens here?" Like, it totally took me off guard. Was not expecting that.
Give us a couple other, because we have such a good time having this conversation with coaches, because the stuff that you all have to manage, it's just head scratching sometimes.
Yeah.
Look at Mike Day.
Some of these are head scratching in
Mike Day.
Oh, that's a great one. Yeah, COVID presented all of us, I think, that we're leaders, with some really interesting opportunities, because none of us had ever dealt with anything like that before. So there were so many examples during COVID. But I do think even without COVID, and clearly we're still in COVID, but like every day there's something that comes up that you're probably not expecting.
And it could be as simple as a basketball coach going in and it's his first team talk, and the best player who's got all the equity with the locker room is bouncing the ball when they're talking. How do you manage that scenario? They're just little things. If someone's late and they give you an excuse, and it's like, that it's not telling the truth, but it's your best player. It's just all of these gray area things that you have to navigate is what makes leadership so challenging in terms of building trust. And so I'd like to show you something I think is just so cool on how the Gonzaga men's basketball team, very good American basketball team at the college level here, manages that and defines it. So they were down to a lesser opponent at halftime. They end up coming back, winning the game in convincing fashion. And then after the game, they interviewed head coach Mark Few. What did you tell your team at halftime? And here's what he said.
Be us. That was not us. I mean, I was like, guys, you're doing things we haven't even seen in practice, as far as just trying things with passes and dribbles on the first side. And that's the beauty of this year's team. They really listen and they really try. And they came out and played a whale of a second half.
And sometimes it's that simple, isn't it, Becky? Is get back to being us. And one of the things that they use is a thumbprint. And the idea is that the bulldog is the culture, but everyone's going to bring their unique individual DNA and put their stamp on the team. And then that's going to create a team identity for the year. And the reason they like this logo, much like the iPhone logo, is it doesn't fill in all at once. It takes time. And there's an educational process that they go through to define that identity. So if you look right here, here's an example of how they do that. This was the conference player of the year getting emotional with the ref. So that is an undesired behavior because everybody else is taking their cues from him. And when that happens, the whole team gets emotional. So we'll show that to the team, but then we'll also show this. So this is Gonzaga playing basketball. They're on the defensive side, and all the guys are diving on the floor, which is looked at as really blue collar work. So the same player that was getting emotional with the refs, he gets up and says, "On the floor, boys." So they take pride in doing the dirty fundamentals that help teams win. And so what we try and do is illustrate that's what makes teams win, and draw a line between winning behavior and losing behavior. And then the goal is to catch above the line behavior, the stuff that wins, and then to convert below the line behavior into winning behavior. Becky, I know that this model has been a very simple model that we've communicated to the teams that you've coached.
I think it's such a simple model, but it's so it's so easy for us to focus in on the things that are going wrong and the undesired behavior. And I think sometimes as leaders, we forget to recognize and promote the things that are going well. And those are really important because it is a model for your team to see what is actually right.
And Becky, when they watch themselves do it, how is that a force multiplier? And then how can you do that in a private sector environment where they're not filming the events?
Yeah, that's a little different, but I do think there's all sorts of things that happen that you could highlight that are positives. You know, like in my work environment, the corporate side of my work environment in college, you know, we had shout outs where we could recognize things that people did in a positive way, and that went in our newsletter. I just think that it doesn't have to be filmed. I think this is a great way to highlight it because you can actually see it because it's on television. Clearly, it's not everyone's environment, but I think there are ways to bring out great behaviors and behaviors that are undesirable.
And that is managing. And one of the things that I heard is that to preserve the health of the team, the coach collectively points out the behaviors that win and then privately points out the behaviors that need to be converted. We're going to drive into model, which is all the time. And the thing about modeling is, as coaches, your actions are always sending signals. And one of my favorite clips comes from the great Will Ferrell in the movie Old School. Take a look at this.
We can't have anyone freak out there, okay? We've got to keep our composure. We've gone too far. There's too much to lose. We've got to just keep our composure.
Becky, why do you love that one so much?
Oh man, I mean, how much opposition can you have compared to what he's saying to what he's actually doing?
His words are in direct conflict. He's saying, keep our composure, as he slams the chair. And it makes me think of how important consistency is in building trust. And one of the most consistent coaches we have over here is Bill Belichick. And this is a question that a reporter asked him: with all you've accomplished in your coaching career, what's left that you still want to accomplish? And here is what Bill Belichick said. And if you think about that, that shows that he is locked into the now, and his disciplined thought process will not be pulled into the future or the past. Becky, what did Kelly Perez just say Sunday night? That her team exists in one time zone. Did you hear that?
Yeah, she wants her team to exist in one time zone, and that time zone is the present, not the future or the past. Love that.
It was a creative way to say be present. And when I showed this to an athletic director, he said this: if I want my team to be in the moment, then I need to be in the moment. And when he said that, for whatever reason, it stuck with me that this could be an incredible modeling tool, that whatever we want from our team, then we need to be the physical manifestation, and we just fill in the blanks there. Becky, I know that this tool really spoke to you.
It did, because I just think of, you know, this is talking to me about the day-to-day behaviors that I bring. So if I want my team to be resilient, then I have to be resilient. If I want my team to be energetic, I need to be energetic. And I felt like, man, I need this on a t-shirt to like put it on every day, bring what I want my team to be.
And Becky, you went as far as like, this is a perfect mirror tool where you can put this in a mirror, and then it's a reflection piece when you brush your teeth in the morning.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think all of us have an idea of what modeling is. I just don't know that it's always present in our mind that we are modeling. And I think this is just a great reminder.
And another reminder is Mark Few, the head coach. We gave the team a sheet of paper, and we said, what is the best lesson that you've learned from head coach Mark Few? And far and away, the number one answer was how to be a good husband and good father. And I asked Mark, how many conversations have you had with them about that? And he smiled and said none. When I shared that story, Becky, what did that tell you about Gonzaga?
Well, I think it just told me about anybody that your actions speak way louder than your words, because clearly they have taken cues from him about his behavior in terms of those two subjects, but never having had conversations about that just shows you the power of those cues.
And Becky, Mark just got a DUI. I mean, that's not lost on us. And I can tell you, being inside of that program, it's a scenario where he sits down, he acknowledges, and what's so cool about Mark is he's not a perfect guy. He acknowledges that, and he owns it with his team. And then what's been really neat is anytime you have a public position and something like that happens, it's not so much the coach that I am ever concerned with. It's more the kids and the spouse, because they get so much more of the local noise than the coach does. And really, they're not trained to handle that level of criticism. Becky, what have you learned about that?
Well, and not only are they not trained to handle that criticism, there's nothing they can do with it. With the coach, like you mentioned, you can sit down with your team, you can have a proactive conversation, and you feel like, you're able to express it. When your kids are at school and they're saying, hey, your dad got a DUI, or your wife is getting harassment from people, like, that's really hard because there's nothing to do with it.
And again, I just want to speak to the power of the tool is that even when you mess up, because modeling is not about perfection, because nobody's perfect. It's not acknowledging accountability. And so when he sits down and said, I made a mistake, I'll be better, here's what I'm going to do, his team sees how he confronts adversity. And there's powerful lessons inside of that. And so essentially, I think what it all comes down to, we're going to try and do, is to really dive in how to do each of those at a very high level. So we're going to go ahead and get started with defining. And so one of the things that I'd like to show you is a clip from Bill Belichick, who coaches the New England Patriots. And I'm going to challenge you all to pull that chat up. And I want to know something. Why do you think when I showed this to elementary principals, they said, this is my life?
A player can't overcome bad coaching. So if you don't teach them the right way to do things, then it's hard for them to do them right. So it's important for the coaches to give the players a good plan, a good level of instruction, and an opportunity to be able to go out and perform and execute their job. And so if you teach them that, then you have a chance for that to happen. If you don't teach it to them, then so the chances of a player getting that on his own and just totally figuring it out without much help is it's putting a lot of pressure on the player. So a coach has to do his job and teach the information and the concepts in a way that the players can comprehend them and execute them.
And so think about this, because I was so curious when they were saying just how much they related. They gave me this. Bex, what do you think?
Well, I think it speaks directly to what he's saying. Like, you would not expect a kid in kindergarten to know how to do all these things the day they walk through the door. But sometimes when, we're on a high level team, we expect people to understand things when they walk through the door without the benefit of really defining things for them before they get started.
Well, it goes back to that. What are your thoughts on that line?
Well, I think the bad coaching in this scenario is not making clear what the expectations are. And I think that we do that often as managers and leaders. We are thinking in our own time zone of, I've been here for 20 years and I know exactly how to do this, but somebody else, it's their first day. And have you taken the time to clearly define?
Amen. And I think, again, if you look at how simple this is, now Gino Ariema, who we love at What Drives Winning, he is the UConn's women's basketball coach. He will say that a great player can play for any coach. That's what makes them great. So the reason I talk about that is because I don't want to introduce confusion into this. But Becky, if you think about football compared to American basketball, football is an organization. It's people. Go ahead, Bex. You had a reaction.
No doubt. I mean, just to give context, an American football coach, in collegiately could have like 100 players easily. and you have position groups, and you have coaches that are over position groups, and then you have staff that are associated with things like strength and conditioning, recruiting, all these different things. So basically, a head coach of an American college football team is probably the CEO of a low end 175 person corporation, low end.
And so there can't, whereas one player in basketball can influence the game. So when LeBron James left the Cleveland Cavaliers, they went from being the best team in the East to the worst team in the East because of one player. And when LeBron went to Miami, they became the best team just because that is something that one person can impact the whole. So I really love Bill Belichick's thinking because you're dealing with it at large scale. And this is probably one of the simplest lines, but the most real lines when it comes to coaching. Talk to me, Becky.
Well, if you don't teach them the right way or your way, then it's going to just be open to interpretation. And my way of doing things might be very different than someone else's who's come from a different setting.
And literally, kindergarten teachers are the absolute best to train us on how much assumptions lose. Because if you assume that they know, well, of course they know how to cut with scissors. You find out, hey, they're doing
the person in front of you's got a little haircut.
Exactly. And so when I shared that with Mike Gunn, who's also a coach, he said that productivity matches the clarity of direction. And he's a thinker that people don't fail, systems do. Now, we all know that there's nuances where that's not true, but the reality is that when you have that mentality, then you have incredible accountability on how you do things. And again, this is how he looks at it. Becky, did you look at things similarly?
Yes, for sure. Like in our sport, coaching, it doesn't really happen as much during the game, but you sure can tell if coaching hasn't happened much during the week when you see the result of what's happening in the game, and not the actual outcome, but the result of what's happening during the play.
Well, and I'd just like to show you all something. So in college football, recruiting is a really big thing. And so the top 10 teams had 30 plus guys that were either 4 or 5-star guys. So as we're looking in some of the, Joseph said that they hire people on raw skills. This is identifying raw skills. Here's how many Minnesota football had when they were in the top 10. And Becky, PJ Fleck is the head coach there. He's become a good friend. How would you give context on his approach?
Well, I would first say that PJ was a 5th grade teacher, which I think has served him well in his role as a collegiate coach. He is just a great definer in ways that he can tell you the same message 20 different ways, but it's the same message. And he's so creative with the way that he does that. And I've seen that in action.
Do you want to explain this?
Yeah, How You for him is just a program of how you do basically anything within their program. Just to give you just like one simple example, when they have new players come in, they have to learn how to use the weight room. And before they actually go in the weight room and work out, they will have already been through an orientation in the weight room with the strength coach. They will have walked through watching the older players. They will have gone slowly through with a player that's higher than them, that's been there before. And then finally they will go in with the strength coach and work out. And they still have a player with them that's older than them going through the whole thing. And just that level of confidence in what you're doing, because now they've seen it 4 times before they actually have to enact it. That's pretty impressive.
And Becky, everyone has training methods. What I think is so unique to him is what he trains. So you just walk through the mechanics of how we're going to move inside the weight room, but talk about how he trains pace inside of that.
Oh yeah, nothing. You don't walk from event to event in the weight room. It's a sprint, and it's highly energetic. And PJ models that, first of all. Like when he comes to practice, when he comes in a meeting, he does not walk in a meeting. Like he runs into a meeting and it's like very energetic, and it is very consistent the way he modeled pace.
Amen. And we got a fan in Sue Bork, Ski-U-Ma. Hey, so what I will say is, what does he put in the way he would answer that is, anything that is expected is defined. Anything that is expected is defined. And someone else that's very similar to that is Tim Corbin. Becky, Tim, it might be the best coach that we have in our American collegiate system.
I agree with that. I think Tim is a baseball coach and he's been very, very successful. But I think one of the big reasons he's successful is because he combines like a classroom setting along with his on the field teaching. And those two things really go hand in hand in his program.
And to your point, Becky, this came out after winning a championship, and this is a player picking out the dugout. Now, some people will look at that and think that that is, high level character, which obviously it is. But he starts every practice before they hit the field in this room right here, the classroom. And he's talking about things that are totally unrelated to baseball itself. For example, here is one of the lessons that he covers. And so these things are not happening by chance. These are learned behaviors. And he's going to talk to you about what he tries to do the first meeting with the team.
It's an hour and maybe 15 minutes, an hour and a half. And I don't speak to baseball one time.
Instead, he shows this. He says, this is where we are right now. We're building foundations. And here's where we're going to be at the end of the year. And every day is a PhD on how to build different levels onto that foundation. There is nothing left to interpretation. Here's an example. They have a fall cleaning day. These were all the spaces that needed to be cleaned before everyone went home for Christmas break. And so he would show, this is what it looks like now. This is what it's going to look like after. And Becky, this is not about how to clean. This is about something much different.
Yeah, I think it's just about closing the gap of interpretation on your standards. It's pretty hard to look at those two things and not know exactly what you need to do.
And by taking care of the environment, that's the word that he believes in, that creates a culture over time. And I was just there last year. I love this because basically it was on the heels of a bad practice. And he put this up. He said, have you ever seen a team like this? Heads down, sloppy, everybody going in their own direction. How would you describe this? Where do they learn it from? And what he's trying to do is delineate, here's who we are, here's who we're not. And again, showing them what's sheep behavior and what's lion behavior. And they have the lion reel. And someone that's not all too different, Becky, is Mike Krzyzewski. And this is something that most coaches don't do. I just like you to tee off on this, Becky, as soon as you hear this.
It produces discussion. It gives them ownership, or it gives them a chance. If you tell them the answer before you ask the question, it may only be your answer. If you ask the question, they answer the way you want to, or you can figure it out how that is, then the answer is both of yours. And so you all have ownership over that answer.
So obviously he's talking about the benefit of asking questions. That's something that you really tried to inject into your coaching process. What have you seen with that?
Well, before I talk about mine, I think you all will see as we go through these 4 courses that, Brett's the best question asker I know. He gets really good at getting to the heart of the matter and getting deep quickly. But more importantly, he asks questions that make the person that he's talking with dig deep to find their own answers. And I think what Coach K says is absolutely right. You're not giving someone the answer, you're helping them get to their own answer.
And Becky, what's an example of you doing that with a player?
Sometimes with my collegiate team, especially, we have college kids who are all over the map with everything that's happening in their life. And so when they would come in for an individual meeting, the first question I would ask them is, what's the most important thing we should be talking about? And it just led me to what was important for them, instead of me kind of assuming they wanted to talk about playing time or something else.
And when you realized, because I challenged you to go through, anybody that wants to get better at asking questions, I'm going to give you the same challenge that I gave Becky. Just try from a management perspective for the next week to only ask questions. So no statements, only questions. It will be clunky as hell, but if you stick with it, you start to become efficient. Why are coaches afraid to do that, Becky?
I think as leaders, people feel like internally that we have to have all the answers. And I think that that's, it's like writing the ship. We have to write the ship all the time. And I think that the answer is different. It's really about, can you ask the right questions to get that person to be able to write the ship themselves?
Because the autonomy produces long-term results. It's a short-term inconvenience because telling is always quicker, but do they own it? And will you have to continue to tell if they don't own it? And so when Coach K came in to take over the Olympic team, it was their worst finish in organizational history. They were 5-3 and they finished third. And I asked them, what was the best team building activity you did for that first group? And here's what he said.
Probably the most important one I've had was the night before we started practice with the Olympic team, the 2008 gold medal team in Beijing, where we never talked about basketball. We talked about standards. These are things that Kobe Bryant, Jason Kidd, LeBron James, Dwayne Wade, and all these guys said. It was about how we were going to live. And everybody on the team contributed, and we came up with 15 standards. Not being late, no excuses, being flexible, looking each other in the eye, always telling each other the truth, having each other's back. And when we left the room, they became the way we were going to live together. And it was a great, great team building exercise.
Becky, a couple of things. First one, when you look at these standards and compare it to the kindergarten list, what do you notice?
I don't really think they're that different. Like the kindergarten is talking about eye contact and about being on time and telling the truth. I mean, I think that it's crazy when you think this is the highest level athlete in our country and we're talking about kindergartners and the similarities are the same.
And think about this right here. How do you think about that from a coaching perspective?
I think that, it reminds me of like when I was a younger coach and a player wanted to come meet with me and, I'd be worried for days about what it was. I was hoping they would meet with me like the next hour so I wouldn't have all that anxiety. And now as an older coach, I'm pretty convinced that I'll be able to handle whatever someone brings to me. And that just reflects your experience. So the more I can define things on the front end, it's because I know all these things are going to happen at some point. A newer coach may have no idea what to expect.
And whenever you have them bring the standards, what does that create, which ultimately leads to accountability? How do you think about that?
I think that gone are the days of the hierarchy of top down. I think, at least in dealing with the age groups that I'm dealing with, the ownership part is really important to them. And once they have ownership, it's hard for them to go back on their own standards that they've created. And that's where the accountability comes in.
And there's such a debate with coaches around standards and rules. What have you learned about that conversation?
I think rules can really paint you into a corner because then you're black and white and you're really having to treat everyone exactly the same. And I think standards give you a little bit of flexibility, but it's also something that you can live up to as opposed to rules being something that sort of like feels like it holds you down.
And that's exactly what we've heard is
your primary
basically when you have rules, they're designed to force control. Standards is to inspire your best version. And this is the last thing that Coach K said. He believes that this is the primary responsibility of a coach.
Your primary responsibility as a coach is to become one with a player and then become one with the team. And that's what you should be spending most of your time on.
Becky, that could be so easy to gloss over.
It is. And, we think the primary responsibility of a coach is to do all the X's and O's and make sure the numbers are right and the outcomes are right. But in the end, if we are not at one with our team and we are not creating environments where they can do their best work, basically, how do we expect those other things to happen?
Isn't it crazy? And if you're trying to figure out, well, what do we define? How do we define an identity? Here's a glossary that we worked with coaches to essentially identify the characteristics of the teams that they've had that have won. And so if you think about this, if you were going to maybe pick 3 performance skills that you wanted to define your approach as a leader or your teams, what would those 3 be? And then if you go over to the relational side, what would those be?
And can I mention, Brett, that I think that sometimes also as coaches, we tend to focus our attention on the performance skills only. But if you're working within a team setting, those relational skills really come up hard and fast if you're not emphasizing them, because it will put obstacles in your way of performance if those relational skills aren't in place too.
Amen. And so I think the biggest question is, where do I start? And so I think that maybe the first part is asking this question: what's in your how you? And one of the things that I did for a basketball team is I went to a game, sat behind their bench, and I asked them what they wanted to accomplish this year. And they had very high standards on what they wanted to do. And so what I looked at is all the action between the action. So what was happening between the plays that wasn't functioning at the standard that they wanted to achieve. And I made a list of that in the game.
This is really enlightening, by the way. Translating this into your own environment is really enlightening, because I did this with my team. And, it's so easy to get distracted by the actual action of a sporting event, probably just like it's so easy to get distracted by the action of your business. But it's those things that happen in between that action that actually affect the outcome of the action.
And quite frankly, it's what wins at the very highest level. But so few coaches understand that until they get very close or they actually do it. They realize, wow, all my great teams were able to do this. And some of my championship teams actually had less talent, sports specific, than some of my better teams that didn't achieve as much. And once you start to understand that, you start to value this a little bit differently. And so what do you do with it? It's very simple. You just realize that assuming that they know how to handle that, that loses. And so what you can start to do is just think about right now, what is one thing that you need to define better for your team? So maybe just think through that, and then we'll show you how to navigate that. What's one thing that you need to better define for your team? And then the step in the roadmap is, how do you teach it in a modern way? Becky, why do we underline modern?
Well, because I think that no one wants to sit on another 1,000 Zoom calls, right? Hopefully this is a different one than you're used to. But I think it's like finding ways to be creative in that the message will actually stick. And I think a lot of times that's through, media or pictures or quotes or something other than just talking at someone.
And so one of the things that Chris Peterson, who's another football coach who you all will become familiar with, he had a term called master teacher, and that was an expectation for them. And how do you evaluate whether or not someone is? One question: do they inspire learning? And that was all born from the fact that when he became a head coach, he would go in and sit in the other 9 coaches' meetings, and he would observe their capabilities of taking what's in their mind and getting their players to understand and execute that. And he realized that Coach 4 was so much further ahead than Coach 6. And in 3 months, he realized, wow, the incremental value of being a great teacher. And so the question becomes, once you know how or what you need to teach, how do you do that in a very modern way? And Becky, do you want to share how Chris talked about how to handle confrontation in the bar? Because that's a big thing in football.
Yes, he would do a skit with his team where he would have like an unsuspecting new player ask to be part of this skit, and they would pretend that they were in a bar and they were talking, and he's saying to the kid, "Hey, what do you do?" He's like, "Oh, I'm on the football team." And then he would say, "Oh, you guys suck," and then it would start to get a little testy, and he would throw a fake beer, like a cup of water, in this guy's face. And of course the guy wants to get all, bowed up about that. But it just shows you, like, if you haven't practiced that scenario, that's a very real scenario that could occur in a college town. And if you haven't demonstrated like how to best handle that situation, it could easily go bad quickly.
And it's an engaging way to get people to lean in. Because if you just say, "Hey, don't get in fights," that's not working in these days.
And, the whole team is watching that whole thing happen. So they add to the energy for sure.
Amen. And that brings us to the last part, is how do you measure understanding? And one of the things that Chris did, would he give them a culture quiz with his staff. And he said that this is the nuance, though. This is for me. This isn't for you. He did not look at if they got a bad grade, that it was a reflection of their incompetence. He looked at it, if they got a bad grade, it was him not being a good teacher. His mentality, keyword mentality, there are no bad students, only poor teaching. Becky, obviously we know that there are people that don't pick things up, but when you have that mentality, what does that do for you?
I think it makes you curious about how do you reach that person? How can you try different ways to reach that person that might not be the same as the way you reach other people?
And one of the things that we really wanted to do is make sure that we left about 9 to 10 minutes for you all to ask any questions that you would have. So this is the define section. This would be the roadmap, figuring out what you want to address in your how you, doing it in a modern way, and then having creative ways to measure understanding, which essentially, Becky, we do that with questioning, cold calling, figuring out how quick people are with us. So what we're going to challenge you all to do, if there was one question that you had based on what we've covered thus far, what would it be? Can you put that into the chat for us? And then we will try and knock out as many as we can in a very fast way, but get you out of here on time. Anything, closing thoughts, Becky, while the questions come in?
I do think that the assumptions part can't be overstated, because I think that when you've been doing something for a long time, it's very easy for it to be like, well, this is the way we've always done it, and not have innovation in the way that you want to do it, or even be willing to share the way that you need to do it with somebody that hasn't already been in that environment. So I feel like define, like even me as an experienced coach could have used work on the defining part late in my career. I think we all can use it.
All right. So Becky, I'm going to let you curate the chat.
All right. Let's see what we got here. Okay, Brett, I'm going to just throw these at you, and then we'll knock them out as quickly as we can. So first one is from Vince. How do you translate high performance mentality to only a 9-to-5 culture?
I would say that I would try and Vince, I wish that there's no way we can hear Vince. Is that right, Becky, with this form of Zoom?
I do not believe so. Vince, can you unmute and speak? Nope.
No, they cannot. It's only the chat function that's available.
Got it. So Vince, the reason I ask is because I don't want to give you just a stock answer. I'd be curious to hear specifically what you're dealing with your people. At first blush, with very limited context, I would just try and take it away from time, because one of the things that we see in America is a coach who overworks but has very little activity. And there's a really good friend of mine who actually, he's my age, just signed an $18 million contract. And he has a deal where he literally only works 9 to 5. And even when he was younger, he did that because he knew what he was shooting for in the future. And so he said, if I extended the 5 p.m., that I might be able to get a little bit more done, but my efficiency factor would take a hit. And so his objective by keeping that window was to train efficiency. Now, obviously, there's going to be reactive situations that you have to deal with that might extend you personally beyond the 9 to 5. But to me, it would always be like, what is your best version? What is your next level? Those would be the questions that I would ask. What is our next level? How do we know we're hitting it? And then you can take them away from just checking the boxes.
Yeah. And I think if I am reading into Vince's question, it's also about like somebody who has a career and somebody who has a job, like the difference, like how do you convince someone who has a job to be more on the investment side of a career?
That's a beautiful point. We'll go on to Nathan Camp. Nathan, it sounds like maybe we can hear you. So talk to us, brother.
Let's try this. I'm getting thumbs up. So yeah, I guess the question for you guys is, originally I was like, how many changes or tweaks have you been able to implement with your players before there's that moment of confusion? Like, hey, how absorb all of this new information and make these changes? And really, I think that the two of you are probably taking a much more systematic approach in your coaching. And I'm curious, what does that preparation look like? And how would you talk to coaches about doing that layered approach instead?
Bex, why don't you jump on that one first, and then I'll follow up.
Well, Nathan, I think it's a really good conversation. And I think for me personally, like I have to get straight in my mind what I need to define so that I have a streamlined approach before I try to define it for someone else. That's the first place my mind went with that. But there's no doubt that things are going to arise that you haven't defined. And I think that's sort of a second layer of the question you're asking, like, how do you use those as more teaching moments instead of getting really frustrated? Because it might lead to behavior that's below the line, but if you haven't defined it, could you really hold someone accountable to that behavior at that point?
And just to piggyback, Nathan, off what Becky said, is maybe a question, and this could go back to Vince's question as well, is my favorite question to ask people is, what are the top 3 things that are getting in the way of us maximizing our ability as a team? And then have them list those out. And what we do with that, and we did that when we took over at Orlando, Becky, is we then trend out everyone's answers and we prioritize the themes that emerge. And then that becomes a curriculum where we could hit on a weekly basis. So at Gonzaga, we have what we called Personal Growth Mondays, where we'd have a 15-minute hit to prime the mentality to take on whatever's relevant during that week. And so that list gives us a curriculum to attack. But to your point, there are going to be things that come up that need to be attacked, where we will then prioritize that over the curriculum. The curriculum just gives us something to anchor into when there's nothing immediately relevant to what we need to do as a team. So hopefully that helps a little bit, Nathan. What we're going to do now is we're going to go over to Joseph Plata. Joseph, can you talk to us? Tell us what you're thinking. Joseph, are you there? Mic's not working, so we'll go over to Jonathan Tice. Jonathan, is your mic working?
I think so.
All right.
So what my question was is just how do you kind of uncover your own managers, and then also get speaking for myself, and then how do you get team members to raise their needs more often? Because a lot of times that's kind of that dialogue, especially remotely, is something that can be tough. And I also encourage folks on my team to join this too, so they're probably listening in, which is great.
Well, why don't we ask your team members to put in the chat, what are Jonathan's blind spots?
Hey, I'm open to
it. I'm just joking, Jonathan. Becky, go ahead and tee off on that one.
I think that goes back to the culture quiz sort of idea, because I think when Chris gave that culture quiz, it really showed where his assumptions were, because he's like, man, I teach this every day. Like, how do they not know? And when he gave him that quiz, it showed him that the things that he was assuming were like clearly defined and clearly easily visible to everyone weren't. And so I think that last part of the evaluation of how people are learning it is really important. And I think there's a lot of different ways to do that creatively.
Becky, one of the lines we love so much is you can't see the label from inside the bottle. So how is it possible that we can basically open them up to where they can get the audits from their team members?
Yeah, absolutely. Audits are, when we came to Orlando, we came mid-season, and it gave us a chance to do like a mid-season audit. And what I thought to myself is, why have I not done mid-season audits when I had a full season, like when it was my own team? And I think that's something that is really great advice, to just periodically figure out where you are.
So kind of like a survey and questions for folks, kind of, or like, how do you do, what's the form of the audit?
I think it would be a conversation, Jonathan, where maybe you and I sat down and talked and just said, hey, what do you think your blind spots are? And maybe you could literally ask that question point blank. What are my blind spots? I'll give you 3 questions. What do I need to continue doing that reinforces our identity? What do I need to subtract that I'm doing that actually undermines what we're trying to do from a team? And then Becky can talk to how important it is to not take those things personal, because if you have the slightest negative reaction, especially if you're in an authoritative position, the information is not going to flow as easily. And you might have no idea that you're reacting a certain way for body language, but they're like reading it very clearly. Becky?
Yeah. I mean, the best example I have of this is, I think this is another example of a way to do it. So I think those questions that Brett just asked are terrific, but I also think if you have someone who can be your truth teller, that can really, you trust to give you that information. And even if you give a bad reaction, they'll still give it. So mine was my director of ops, and, we'd have a big game coming up, and she'd be like, feel like, detecting like a little tension. And I'm like, I am not tense. Like, and clearly I am. So the fact that she would still give me that information, regardless of my response, made her very, very valuable to me. But just another great example is I had a coach from another team, not even my sport, sit on my bench during a game and just make some observations for me. He couldn't get blinded by the sport because it wasn't his sport. And it really helped me see some things that I probably would never have seen.
So that maybe will get you started, Jonathan, and then we'll just take Scott's real quick. Scott, I'm going to give you a good little equation. So there's going to be predictable and unpredictable challenges. And I would imagine with your experience, you can identify quite a few predictable challenges that you'll face that are outside of your control. And so what we have is it's equation from Tim Kite. It's E plus R equals O. I'm not sure if you've heard this, but you're going to encounter many events inside of a performance. So that's the event. The O stands for outcome. And so what you're trying to do. You're trying to achieve the task, whatever the task is. In sport, it's to win. And so the outcome should dictate the response. And they call that the R factor. So if you bring up the uncontrollable events, bad call by the referee, weather, injury, foul trouble, whatever it is, how do we want to respond? That's the R factor. The R factor is what differentiates us from our competitors. Becky, anything you'd add to that?
Yeah, I love that, because the R factor is really the only thing you can control. You can't control the event. We like to think we can control the outcome, but we really can't. But we can control the response.
So Scott, hopefully that gives you something to think about. If it does, it can definitely hit it on the next call. We want to make sure that we're extremely respectful of your all's time. And we've already gone over 3 minutes, so we apologize for that. But the conversation, Becky, it's been so good.
Yeah, I think you guys had some great points in the chat and great questions. So I'm hoping as we go through this, we'll get to know each other more, and that'll even be more free flowing. So thanks for all of that.
And thank you, Maria, for the intro and setting this all up. And we look forward to seeing you all in a couple of weeks.
Great. Thank you so much, guys. And I'll see you in a couple of weeks.
See y'all.
Thank you. Bye.